Hello, and welcome to the ALCTS virtual pre-conference webinar on Trouble Your Magic, Technical Services is Advocacy. This will serve as session 1 in our two-part virtual pre-conference on advocating for your department and library. I'm Erin Elsie, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter today is Angela Galvan. Angela is the collection strategist for Grand Valley State University Libraries. She previously served as Electronic Resources Manager for Brown University Library and Digital Resources and Systems Librarian for SUNY Geneseo. Angela's research interests include critical algorithm studies in library discovery, decay in technology and infrastructure, and digital estates. She's a current editor of Weave, a journal of library user experience. Angela brings much expertise to today's topic, and we're fortunate to have her with us. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSAC19, or you can see it up there in the corner of your screen right now. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions for Angela, please type them into the question box on your GoToWebinar screen. We will have time for questions at the end of the presentation, but you can enter your question at any time throughout the webinar. And if we do not get to your question, our presenters kindly agreed to answer remaining questions in writing, which will be sent out to all attendees. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the webinar concludes. And now I'll turn it over to Angela. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
Hi. So thank you for that introduction. My name is Angela. I will answer questions on the Twitter feed after this webinar is over. So if you do have questions and want to use the hashtag, I will, review those if there are any afterwards, in addition to answering things in writing. So I'm happy to do that. So when I was asked to put this together, it's an unusual topic, I think, and one that's gaining a bit of interest, the idea that advocacy doesn't just happen in one area of the library. And so that's why I had originally agreed to do this. So the idea is that library workers and technical services and technologist roles actually are significant actors in shaping library cultures. And so how does that work in our systems and standards, and how do we kind of surface that work and ultimately trouble the kinds of things that our colleagues might say are magic? So that's why I wanted to do this. Let me see here. So a little bit about me. Between the original discussion about this webinar with organizers and its airtime, June 4th, today I accepted a new position. So as of June 10th, I'll be the collection strategist, like we noted, at Grand Valley State University Libraries in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And my background on this topic comes from many kinds of libraries and experiences, ranging from public library systems, university special collections and archives, and health sciences libraries. But if you were to look at my resume, you'd say I was an academic librarian, and that's where most of my experience takes place. Before my life in libraries, I worked as a hotel night auditor for 10 years. A night auditor is the person who checks you in at 3 in the morning after every travel delay ever, and acts as security, accounting, housekeeping, social worker, bartender, and concierge before vanishing at 7 in the morning like a ghost. So my professional network at the time consisted of flight attendants and club bouncers and oftentimes street kids, people that were in liminal threshold spaces. And I'm telling you all of this now because I think it's the best explanation I have for how I became identified as an advocate in the realm of technical services, because I've always advocated from back of the house positions. And as I moved into libraries, it felt natural for me to continue to do so. If you are registered for both panelists, you'll hear Emily Drabinski talk about this tomorrow, but I too am new at this and learning all the time of how to go about this kind of work. And I imagine that will always be true to a point as the systems and standards and methods that we use in libraries change over time. Nothing is static, right? So there's a tendency not always, but a tendency in technical services to seek really prescriptive answers to the kinds of issues that I want to talk about today. So how you're able to apply them individually in your departments and in organizations will vary depending on your structure, the political situation that you're dealing with, and relative positioning of power. We're the connectors. So thinking about how technical services work can surface those connections in the library is a good place to start. For example, if you're an associate university librarian or director or department head listening right now, you may have a lot more ability to implement change and advocate for your people and their work. In particular, if your organization is extremely hierarchical, so a vertical structure, or has an up, over, and down communication style, or organization where non-management workers lack a lot of agency. So by up, over, and down, I mean ideas go up a hierarchy chain, they go over at the highest levels where they're not necessarily understood as far as their day-to-day implications go, and then back down into separate units for implementation where the idea isn't quite the same anymore. So if you're an only, if we have any of those with us today, so the only person in technical services in your library, or you're in a more horizontal organization, those ideas can play out differently. So understanding that I, cisgendered white lady, will be able to take a lot more risks and break more things and cause more problems than someone else who doesn't identify that way and doesn't look like a librarian looks like. When we think about what librarians look like and who they are, most people picture someone who looks like me. So risks are variable and kind of up to you to feel out where your comfort level is. And again, if you have individual stuff, we can talk about that along the way. Again, if you do want to discuss your individual situation, my contact information will be available, and any communications that come to me directly will be confidential. So hopefully what I can offer today will be opportunities for approaching more conscious kinds of advocacy in technical services. So just very broadly, as much as we can when we tie our work to the library's values or mission, and to things like diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts on behalf of your patrons and colleagues. I find that has gotten me the furthest the most. I often have discussions in particular with metadata specialists and folks who don't necessarily discuss their work in those contexts because it's in progress, is the answer I get. You know, you're doing good work about accessibility and language and all this stuff that's in our catalog and in our discovery layer. Well, it's not done yet. It's in progress. But all work in libraries is in progress all the time. And so waiting until something is finished really, I think, minimizes your work, and it means that you've lost opportunities to educate other people about what it is you do. So start getting in the mindset that outreach and education is part of your job. So the other aspect of technical services work that makes education and advocacy difficult is that there's so very much to learn and so many contexts to apply the work in that it's easier for our colleagues in many cases to accept that we're magical instead of learning about our work. I'm sure if I asked the attendees who are here right now if they've had their work called magic, you can all probably mention in the chat if that's happened to you, if that's something that you want to share, or drop a line on Twitter about an experience where that's happened to you. Being called magical is not a great position to be in because it perpetuates the idea that technical services work is embodied, which is to say the knowledge exists in you, it's part of your body, and that you have the skills and abilities that you do because of maybe your age or because you are a magical fae creature or witch, and not because you spent hours trying to avoid throwing your laptop against a wall, learning regular expressions or JavaScript or MarcEdit or any of the other stuff that you do. So we look at what's technical services exactly. I'm defining technical services for the purposes of this webinar in a fairly broad way here, and that includes catalogers, resource management of all formats, so my e-resources and acquisitions people, metadata, discovery, interlibrary services and systems, including your library services platform, institutional repositories, and anything that might fall under a web services job, quote unquote, because we all wear so many different ever-changing hats. What all of this work has in common is that it powers the central and necessary work of the library, but is often invisible. These are the oxygen jobs. No one notices them until they're not working as intended, when they suddenly expose the structure of the library in uncomfortable ways to our users and patrons. Talk to me when the link resolver is down in e-resources, and I've had the same 2 comments happen on the same day where our link resolver dropped, and it was utter chaos. And also someone told me, well, the link resolver is not really important, is it? And I remember thinking, this will be an interesting lesson today. So increasingly, when patrons think of the library, they're identifying services that technical services workers touch and maintain. So especially in academic libraries, it's easy to limit our thinking about the power of the library to those interactions that we can see and kind of measure that way. The reference and instruction or research teams or adult services if you're in public libraries, or any number of other things, consultations and stuff. And while those services are valuable, their success is ultimately dependent on how well technical services can execute their work and initiatives. So in the abstract for this talk, when I talk about the inherent tension in services work, part of what I'm invoking is what happens when you take the invisible and make it visible to others. That usually comes with a certain amount of risk. So what I'd like to do, in addition to highlighting those tensions, is talk about, potentially how to mitigate that risk for those of you who want to engage in this kind of advocacy. And so the first area of pushback and tension I want to address is one of my own areas of bias here, and that's that libraries simply aren't neutral. And this plays out in several ways. What and whom we create space for, and that includes our staffing decisions, how we hire, how we direct our energies that way, how we buy things and from which suppliers, the implicit and explicit behaviors permitted in our cultures, the data that we collect about patrons, our policies, in particular those that govern access and how we define service to our communities, how we name, describe, arrange, and ultimately discover objects are all inherently contested political decisions that are ultimately made by technical services staff working in the systems and vocabularies that power and make this work happen. So that's a lot to kind of unpack there. So where might we start with this? So I keep working on this webinar, and some of the most significant considerations that libraries are facing right now and in the news are falling squarely into the realm of technical services, but we're the least likely to be appropriately staffed to respond. This is part of why movements like CritLib, so critical librarianship, have, with some notable exceptions, have mostly failed to take into account how library systems and standards influence pedagogy. We have quite a bit of ground to cover, and I'm doing what I can to provide as many entry points as possible for attendees to get started. And I'm naturally leaning into what I understand best. In that case, this is resource management. So I'd like to point out that advocacy takes place in a number of arenas. So ourselves, the work that we do, our departments, and then on behalf of users. How successful we are and how we go about this can be framed by an organizational behavior concept from Amy Edmondson, which is to say, how psychologically safe is it in your library to take risks? You can, in fact, break all kinds of rules in an environment when your colleagues aren't invested or interested in the job you do, but that makes for a pretty miserable work life and not something that's energizing. And we, and by that I mean workers in the United States, spend too much time at our jobs to tolerate misery. So some questions to consider as you go through local workflows and processes, some things I want to offer. So what are the hidden rules of this work? Which is to say, what is and isn't acceptable to change, and what is and isn't acceptable to challenge, and how it's done. For example, many of the institutions I've worked for are absolutely fine with criticism and critique, but it has to be behind closed doors or one-on-one meetings. If you go saying that stuff in an all staff, and suddenly you're the problem, right? Because you pointed out a problem. Which entities define those terms? So who sets the tone for the culture? Usually this is an administrator. Do all decisions have to go through a person? Is there a meeting where those get discussed? And who would have power there? And what would it look like to break or change the rules? Kind of imagining a future where a process was different. And, say you updated something without asking anyone, what would happen to you? And how can you use this information to advocate more? So one way to start with that is through kindness audits. So how are we talking to patrons and each other? What kind of information about our work are we communicating? Resource sharing and circulation are good collaborators here, as is anyone in resource management. If you read your own communications out loud to each other, for example, would you feel comfortable getting those notices? Are things in all caps, which is definitely my favorite thing to get in a notice from a library, is something with all caps in an email. What happens when, for example, the library isn't able to buy an item, or if a user points out that something isn't working as expected? How is that received, and how do we communicate back to them? It's like getting any of you who've tried to spin up Blacklight or worked in Ruby, getting a failure message in Blacklight is this huge, giant, angry red error message. So it says something that's the error message and implies a thing about my skill there. And one thing I want to mention is that nice is not always kind. We get caught up in niceness and librarian nice, and we need to honor directness more and strong opinion more because it signals a great deal of care. I've been in meetings where two people were very, very fired up about usability and how it manifests in metadata in particular. And as impatient as they were with each other in that moment, you can respect that it comes from a significant amount of care and expertise on both sides. And I think remembering that when things get a little intense is useful. So how do we go about doing this, about having empathy and kindness in our services and systems as tech services workers? So this is a screen capture from about the same time I was hired of the resource sharing login page for the Ohio State University's Health Sciences Library. There's a lot of stuff that's bolded and in all caps here. And I was able to get rid of quite a lot of that sort of language. The department processes were so manual at the time that they'd effectively buried themselves in work rather than adapt to changes in their system, in this case, Iliad. This included not having a link to a password reset option, which forced users to call during business hours. And that's not how resource sharing in an academic medical library works. Calls are for rush requests and emergencies, not password resets. And also this please do not re-register in all caps doesn't make a lot of sense. At a campus as large as Ohio State, there might be compelling reasons to re-register, and this language really disregards it. Our overdue notices were very give me the money or give me the stuff, which struck me as unhelpful as well. And so just very minor changes really change the way that patrons receive this kind of service and whether or not they want to use it. This is a screenshot of my former employer, Brown University's journal A to Z list. They have serial solutions, and you can see at the bottom that there is a huge injected section about license requirements and use of licensed resources, and this actually causes the screen to scroll a little bit. So this is just the first part of it, but what it's focused on is all of the things you can't do with our resources, rather than emphasizing the work that resource management does to make sure that patrons can do what they want with a particular article or resource, or reusing figures or open access or any number of the other conversations we could be having in a space that we know so many users go to. Where are we telling patrons that something is simple or easy or quick? I have this conversation as an editor for Weave kind of often. And when I read through tech tutorials, things like OpenRefine or other people's MarcEdit documentation and similar, that these leap out to me as language that isn't inviting, because how we talk to each other matters as much as how we communicate to patrons. This is an example from SUNY Geneseo. This is their branding of Summon, their discovery layer. Right away, research isn't easy. And here the library has gone out of its way to say so. And so failed searches, which happen quite a bit in Summon, end up demeaning the user. But it takes MS Paint to get rid of this. So not an especially, high barrier to entry program. And this is Milne Library at SUNY Geneseo again. Never Neutral is the most circulated library display that they have ever done. This library invited students returning from semester to challenge themselves, to be uncomfortable. One of the things that I love most about working for that, working in the library is that it's not an inherently comfortable space. The growth that we can facilitate is deep and it's often painful. A number of the library workers there created this display in response to the white supremacist march in Charlottesville, and partially in reaction to an increased number of hate incidents on campus, which included the appearance of swastikas in residence hall common areas and on the doors of Black students. And when colleagues of mine in reference and instruction made a point of reaching out to our student workers of color, because in academic libraries are essentially powered by student workers of color because they have work study, we were astonished to hear that we were the only faculty who had reached out to them, which spurred the display. And again, I'm thinking of tech services quite broadly here to include how objects move in the collection, including the space they take up, because it's a clear indication of what the library values. At one point, I added a result for the search All Lives Matter to point to the Ferguson archive, documenting Ferguson. And we would occasionally point to other student services when applicable, especially in response to incidents on campus, because we can't know why someone is searching for something. We don't know what memories or issues it might be bringing up. And it's one way in discovery in particular of letting users know that a human is responsible for search and that we see them. So one way I've tried to create a more compassionate search is by creating links to student groups and services at Brown, in particular for undocumented, low-income, and first-generation students. I did this because one day I decided to search Google as well as Brown's discovery layer for my own identity because I'm a first-generation student. Google is going to make suggestions for me because Google wants to help so that it can learn how to best reinforce those suggestions because useful answers are marketable ones. And so today I'm going to ask it, why are low-income students, or why do first-generation students? And before I can finish my query, Google has offered college dropouts or struggling, in addition to helping me understand what a low-income student might be or why I might want to teach them at all. So search results are complex, and they're shaped by the culture. And what do any of these results say about the searcher, the index, and the subject? I decided that I wanted Brown to say something different, in particular after discovering that search results yielded some less than desirable responses. I decided that we can do better, and this is definitely an instance of asking forgiveness instead of permission, because I think one of the things I said to my boss is that compassion should not take this many meetings. Pointing to a service everyone knows about, but maybe students don't yet, in particular undergraduates, is not something that we need a meeting for. And also in our systems, I want to briefly address the issue of surveillance, because I can value privacy all I want. My professional organization can say it too, but it's workflows and systems that determine how accurate that is for my patrons. So what data are we holding on to and for how long? I've been part of privacy task forces and teams that do that kind of auditing work, and it's really illuminating what we hang on to. We probably don't need easy proxy logs from 2016, just saying. So this, for example, is the patron-facing record for Simone Brown's Dark Matters on the surveillance of Blackness. And then this in particular is what happens when you click on the Mark Record view. And it doesn't especially matter what the intention behind this data collection is. And it doesn't matter that that isn't the most discoverable thing about me. It turns out that this was done entirely without malice. You'll see that my name is in the 970 field. My name doesn't need to be there. But the intent doesn't absolve me of the potential harm here, and I'm willing to bet that I could have made that subfield searchable, and that's a real problem. So I'm of the, hey, listen generation of gamers, so that's where this comes from, older legend of Zelda. So I want to talk about work that others have done, because another tendency in libraries is to reinvent a process specifically for our work without seeing what else is out there. This is the result of Aaron White's team at Virginia Commonwealth University. They've done exceptional work on inclusion with respect to naming and what names appear for our patrons in our systems. So if you work for an organization that kind of bristles at the idea of inclusion for names, you can approach naming from other perspectives that have the same result. For example, getting married or divorced but not legally changing your name. It's one way that you can use the patriarchy to get what you want sometimes, because the patriarchy is just not very bright. One of the limitations that they addressed in library systems was integration with Banner, that Banner still uses legal rather than preferred names. And when we find out about limitations like that, the response to a vendor or service provider should be, why not, instead of accepting that particular norm. And I like how this report situates the library's efforts in the greater context of the university and of issues in higher education in general. I know that EDUCAUSE and its affiliates have run a number of sessions on the technical implementation of preferred names. And one great question that keeps coming up and comes up in Virginia Commonwealth's report is, who really needs access to a name in order to provide a service? Your mileage will vary on audits like this depending on how legal names are used and accessed in your system, but it's absolutely worth pushing against. I don't need to see my name when I log into a library account. I can see a different identifier. And this is a great example of how another library is doing this work. One of the most striking ways I've ever heard cataloging described was by a colleague of mine at Brown in Special Collections. She said that my job is to create a machine-readable history of objects, which is a cool and powerful thing to do. Her work probably hasn't significantly changed in the last couple of years, but what is clearly changing is how she describes it and who's in the room when she does so. There is historical and emerging work, in particular in cataloging and metadata, about this that I simply can't do justice to, except to point you all at the exceptional work being done by folks like Violet Fox and others to organize research and to shape Library of Congress subject headings and other forms of metadata in the cataloging lab. They've had several heading changes accepted, including entries on gender nonconforming people, Afrofuturism, and several entries on indigenous knowledge, especially astronomy, which is very cool. It's a way of surfacing knowledge that might not otherwise be cataloged or explained in a system. And it's a group of people that really welcomes collaboration and shared effort. So if the language used isn't working for the people you're trying to serve, it's possible to change that. My favorite example of this in collections are Simon Fraser University in Canada, their cancellation project, which involves the library and teaching faculty in decision-making process, or the legwork already in process at places like University of Virginia libraries to make how the collection works and is funded as transparent as possible. There's a huge amount of work under the screenshot, so it's worth looking at to see how they've built an infrastructure that supports a conversation. So there's also coordinating feedback, because tickets really make the world go round. How many times have I sat down with a vendor and said something and the response has been, yes, but file a ticket? And I do wonder why we put up with this kind of stuff. This is Wiley sending me a password email in clear text. This is a dark pattern on a website. This is asking for my gender for some reason. In a administrative and configuring account. I don't know why it needs that. And this is outsourcing usability on a really expensive product to my users, in this case, Nexus Uni. And I would be remiss here if I didn't mention my colleague's new book, which is what happens when vendors exploit and ignore someone's generous feedback about their systems. This will be a good entry point in particular if you're encountering a lot of resistance to using a new discovery tool. This is a way for everyone to kind of read things critically and get on board. At Geneseo in particular, I heard this refrain of, we hate discovery and teach to databases. And first of all, that's not acceptable. Even if you're using open source software for this, metadata isn't free. And neither is the labor of people building your discovery layer. One of the areas that I often solicit feedback is, are vendors giving us quality MARC records and quality metadata? Because if the answer is no, then it's not just the cost that appears on the invoice, it's how technical services works to make sure that things function for us. If they're bad MARC records, they're bad MARC records, and vendors need to hear that. Libraries invest too much money in this kind of service to tolerate this response, and yet I've seen it over and over again at nearly every library I've worked for. And I've watched librarians and library workers bend and contort legacy systems to help patrons, but will not see that discovery is their responsibility. Discovery belongs to everyone. It is not a problem that one department solves. And second of all, that we hate discovery and teach to databases is not solid pedagogy. If your patrons only go to specific databases, how literate are they with respect to the variety of tools and services the library makes available? And that's particularly the case for undergraduate education. And some of this is related to the questionable advocacy of one-shot instruction, but is nonetheless a barrier we have to overcome to make discovery better for everyone. And finally, feedback to vendors about discovery layers is critical for discovery to become better and can be leveraged for more favorable pricing. I try to collaborate with reference and instruction people to see if the library's databases and systems are working in a way that's useful for them to teach. And I've often received discounts on those products for demanding better features or pointing out missing metadata. Without exception, the response I've received from vendors is that it's the first time they've heard that kind of feedback. And that's a shame. We could do better, because evaluating resources is not just for reference people. I've done that to the tune of $250,000 at every library that's employed me. So the feedback does matter. Excuse me, systems in particular are an area where isolation is not a good idea. For example, after Dartmouth moves to Alma, my former employee will be the last Ivy using Sierra for their ILS. And if they continue this trend of waiting for other Ivies to do something, their processes and service to patrons simply won't be as strong as it could be until they find allies using their same profile of systems. So I would encourage everyone to look outside their traditional consortial limitations to understand library partnerships, and that's another area to begin. Who has the same setup you do? How might you work together to coordinate feedback about your services platform? So because I'm an e-resources person and a resource management person, here's your licensing crash course. So the execution of what your library values, in particular things on privacy, patron advocacy, and user protections, comes from the license agreement. And I'm going to use Science Direct as an example here. An unmodified Science Direct license contains a non-disclosure agreement. It contains one-sided indemnification and no language about data breaches or privacy. And so, although they vary by license, breaches and leaks in this instance would be covered in things like warranties, indemnities, or limitations of liability, which is a whole other webinar. But even if a license doesn't have a specific clause addressing what the library is trying to advocate for, what the license doesn't specify directly is just as important as the thing that it does. So when a particular license is quiet versus where it's loud, and what parties are represented in the language. And you can ask for revision on several items, and pushback is variable and depends on positioning. A first pass might include things like jurisdiction. The address you have to serve to, should it come to that, for Elsevier is in the Netherlands. And if you push back, some account managers will say it's a legal issue and they can't move the location. And that's not true, because I've spoken to other libraries who were able to relocate, quote unquote, the license. The prevailing law should be in your area because your lawyers know your laws. Non-disclosure agreements. If you can remove anything on your license, this is it. NDAs get in the way of my research, and they prevent me from working with other libraries. And so as I personally return to a tenure track line at a public university, I have to be able to communicate my research output and impact. And anyone can, file a Freedom of Information Act request against my dossier, which means that details would get out anyway. Arbitration, I'm going to, with a huge asterisk, to get advice on this, it's dispute resolution instead of going to court. And I would rather go to court. It depends on how your organization's legal team feels. Some of us will have, lawyers working on behalf of our libraries that are absolutely spoiling for fights, and some of us are we'll just settle out of court, it's fine. So again, talk to somebody about this. Indemnification is a big one. We can't indemnify for our users' behavior, so if Faculty Rockstar posts all of a licensed data set over Tor, you need to take it up with them and not the library. And similarly, if someone feels inspired by Aaron Schwartz, we can shut off access once we're aware of a breach, but we can't be responsible for what happens to that material. Audits is another spot. Elsevier has tried to include this as a condition of use for the Reaxis API, which is a chemistry database. And I think Stanford libraries refuse to hand that over. I think when we hear that a group is a data analytics company, we should believe them, and we should pay attention to the amount of data we're already handing over to them. And last is license modification. Some places try to slip in the ability to alter an agreement at any time, which kind of invalidates your work. Both parties should be able to request a review, but neither party should be able to just change it without notice. And again, all of this is useless without adequate staffing. I go to places and there are so many people working on print and like one person working on e-resources. That seems a little lopsided. If you have the opportunity to be part of shared governance or any other service work outside your library, these can be really valuable spaces to gain allies and support for the kind of work in tech services. Does Florida State University's decision, for example, to end some of their big deals came in part because of the work of many library workers and a faculty senate vote. Sometimes the best way for libraries to gain agency is by becoming more visible in the communities they serve. So how you're able to do that will depend again on your individual situation, but visibility can mean moving away from a perception that the library is just a resource sink and a dispensary. So serendipity is labor, which is the other thing that happens when people come and comment about sort of the physical thing, what they know, the sort of nostalgic view of the library. This is Rebecca Goldman's You Didn't Discover That comic. She's an archivist. One of the ways that we can kind of combat the idea that that serendipity is labor is to highlight when patrons thank your library. Dissertations are a goldmine. We can push back when news media trade in discovery narratives. We can do this over social media. McMaster University Special Collections is definitely the model for this. I forget which outlet, probably Washington Post, mentioned something about discovering a manuscript or an archive, I think maybe one of Bertrand Russell's, and they said, no, this has actually been cataloged and in a publicly searchable finding aid for decades. You didn't discover anything. That was labor. You can push back on personal social media accounts if it's safe for you to do so. Letters to the editor in response, in particular from administrators, and making sure that the people whose work is disappeared like that, making sure that they understand that we see them. So if this happens to a cataloger, an archivist, or whomever, I've made sure that I've gotten in touch with them and said, hey, you know, I saw that and it wasn't great. How can we talk about your work here to make sure that that kind of thing doesn't happen to you on a daily basis? So sometimes decision makers in an organization will only consume certain kinds of information about the profession. So this might be certain blogs or organizations or white papers, or they might admire the work another library is doing and reference it a lot. So finding out what information motivates them and getting your ideas to the table through another source is one way to combat this tendency. If it feels like inception, this is because it is. In particular, if your leadership tends to take credit for things or wants all projects to belong to them, quote unquote, you have to get them to believe it was their idea. And yes, this would be easier if we would just listen to each other and trust one another to do good work. But it's clear that doesn't happen everywhere, and we each have a right to survive in our circumstances. Realistically, we all have biases about information sources, and leveraging them to accomplish our goals is reasonable. I'm not really a fan of some information outlets in library and information science, but I understand their purpose and agenda. So some other ways to accomplish this is to mimic communication styles and document structures, sort of like this cat is doing, because it's not a webinar in libraries without a cat picture. At my previous employer, following the resignation of our university librarian, the new head of the library was appointed from the office of the provost. And this is because we had a number of vacancies at the administrative level, so it wasn't entirely unexpected. I noticed our new leadership had extensive experience developing operational plans for the university, and he liked particular document structures to describe stakeholders, goals, and necessary support and outcomes, that kind of stuff. So when our technical services group had to write a significant multi-year cross-departmental project, I used the same framework, and the project was approved almost immediately, and I've seen my own language in future documents. The containers we use to communicate about our work are just as important as the ideas themselves. And when new leaders appear, we can ask what kind of project management tools or formats they like, and be prepared to offer your own if they can't answer. So I'm asked a lot about this question, this idea of should I ask permission, forgiveness? I'm of the mind that there's a third one, which is the carefully arranged accident. We can break stuff. A really good candidate for this is stuff like Open Access Week is such a good time to break e-resources. Big cancellation projects done right actually gain leverage allies and collaborators for the library, not lose it. So these are all things to keep in mind if something does feel chaotic or constant change, or kind of embracing that and sort of seeing what mileage you can get out of it. So how does education in all of this work? I found that office hours and open houses work, in particular if you mirror the same language that your patrons use for that kind of thing. So if that's the language they use, great. If they use something like drop-in, you'll want to use that too. These are really good, especially open houses are really good for highlighting day in the life stories and project work, like a day with metadata or a day in cataloging, or here's the cool thing I'm doing in special collections sort of stuff. And sharing with each other as well as departments is just as important, especially in larger libraries or in libraries that are lacking leadership in your area, like if there's just too many vacancies at the top. That can include things like journal clubs or reading clubs, stuff like Sophia Noble's Algorithms of Oppression, or going back to things like Hope Olson's Power to Name, are interested to review as a group. Again, I mentioned my colleague Matt Reedsma's new book. If your organization is more responsive to white guys, definitely use him. And you can invite other library tech services workers to attend this kind of stuff if that's possible. This can be really helpful for people who are new to a particular geographic network, or people who need to be re-energized about their jobs. Get together and talk about the thing that you all care about. It can help, kind of re-energize that work. So talk about finding allies, which is another thing to do. You need new channels for communications. Emails, for example, do not typically get people to do things. They get people to confirm tasks that they've already agreed to do in another setting. One of the things that I've looked at is like who publishes in open access journals, or who are the other maintainers in the communities that I'm in. So who are the people that also have the oxygen jobs? Constantly assessing your communication channels for effectiveness. If you're constantly putting stuff out and no one's responding to it, you may not be going where they are. So making sure that you do that is useful. Who else in your org is done being nice instead of kind? There's always another person who's a little bit cranky. Finding out who they are in another department can actually be really helpful. And then promoting your work when it goes out there and asking other people to do the same. I don't think it's boastful or egotistical to build each other up. I think it's necessary, especially when you're trying to, again, make visible these invisible things and structures. And so, notes on addressing resistance. There has to be a safe space for failure, and you have to prove it. You have to show that you can't break things. When I was in a public library, one of the things I would do is I would help people who were not very familiar with technology do things like set up an email address. They'd be very nervous about touching the computer, and I realized it's because they felt it was very fragile. And so picking it up and kind of moving it around and showing you're not going to break it, and if you do, it's a keyboard, it's okay, was really helpful. And mapping out processes together, that can be really helpful, especially if your library is very siloed, because documentation is an act of care and resistance. There's lots of discussion about RDA and how, as a standard, it's being locked up. So if everyone could just publish your documentation, we'll get around that, and otherwise make problems for people that want to insist that we adhere to a standard and then lock it up. Other ways of addressing resistance. This quote came from a user at Ask a Manager, one of my favorite websites, and it is, "We are all coming to the table today knowing that everyone did their best with the knowledge and resources that they had at the time. And now that we have new knowledge and resources, we're going to reevaluate the process to ensure we're still making the right decisions." And I don't think that library workers are change adverse or find new ideas inherently bad, but I do think it's a human thing to be afraid of failure and discomfort or not being heard, which is often what happens. So some of these suggestions are about the psychological impact of change management and advocacy. It's why mimicking writing style or document structure works, because it's a familiar framework around a potentially unfamiliar idea. And both the people who want to change things and those people who are confronted by it have to recognize each other's need for psychological safety. So if the system isn't working, it's not your fault, but we can all fix it together. If you are a supervisor, holding space for experimentation and failure because you don't get the shiny innovative thing without that. In particular, delay or schedule your emails if you respond to them outside of office hours. It creates a weird expectation. Stop apologizing for taking sick or vacation time if it's available to you. Don't let your staff do it either. And honestly, if you got promoted into a situation where you don't know a whole lot about what happens in technical services, it's okay to ask for education. Really, my best bosses do this, and I know that it's super vulnerable for people in leadership to admit that they don't know what they're doing, but at the end of the day, you're in power and you need to understand what's happening. It's okay to ask us. We'll really be happy to tell you. And that's just in case if there are any supervisors who happen to be on the webinar today. Also, as a result, we'll have to disruptively every now and then in these kinds of change management meetings, which is sadly a common problem in libraries. So learning ways to disarm them is critical if your library has one. And these are some techniques that have worked for me in the past when I've encountered intense resistance to an idea or when people have been really dismissive of technical services work. And if it's safe to do so, invoking invisible diversities, or what did you mean by that? Or what I'm hearing you say is this. And, as I said, this varies widely by the amount of safety that you have, but really shutting those people down is everyone's job. And a lot of this making the invisible visible, it's a slow process, and to keep documenting and working through your ideas. And sometimes we measure progress in really small victories and small steps. And honestly, that's okay to do. And also that if you need to, it's okay to leave. If you're in a dysfunctional organization that doesn't respect or understand your work after good faith efforts, you might consider leaving. I know that's not possible for everyone due to, local situations and family and community and stuff. And as someone who's moved around a fair bit, it's not easy to do. But at the end of it, it's something to consider, in particular if a significant portion of your identity is found in your job, because no job is worth being miserable. If you're a manager and you notice that many people are leaving, understand that even if they are moving on to categorically better positions, that you're most likely hearing the socially acceptable, polite reasons for exit, and that the saturation of degree holders will not save a toxic organization. And it's not your responsibility of any one person to save it. It's not your job to come in and save and advocate for everything, because there's an entire organization to do that. It can't just be one person's job. It has to be everyone's. So that's about the end of what I have to offer today. I'm slightly under time, but I feel like that's all right in case there are questions about a specific situation or potentially something I didn't cover or other ways that we can talk about this.
All right, thank you, Angela. That was really fantastic, and I probably drove a lot home for quite a few of us. So as Angela had mentioned, we do have time for questions. So if you have not already done so, please go ahead and type your question into that go-to control panel you should have on the side of your screen. And the first one we have in is that one of our attendees say they found the 970 Galvan, A example interesting. In their experience, catalogers are eager to include their initials and or names within MARC records. Is there a risk associated with recording this information in BIB records?
That's a really good question, because it gets pretty directly at the surfacing of labor. I think that it's very different when it's speaking to your question. It's very different when someone is consenting to have their labor recognized by adding their initials or another symbol that they're using to identify their work and their often extensive work on original cataloging and that sort of thing, rather than my name appearing in the 970 field, which was done without my knowledge or consent, and because I had made a purchasing recommendation. It's different, I think, than me claiming that sort of labor. I think probably that people who add initials into records will have to sort of assess for themselves, kind of on balance, what do I want to claim in terms of putting out into the world, versus it's sort of an individual decision, but it is a very good question. I think it has to do ultimately with consent.
Okay, great, thank you. And another one says, my university definitely uses preferred names in Banner. Would that be a local customization that was done by our IT at a university level?
Yes, that would be a local customization. The preferred name stuff in Banner and SysWeb and that kind of stuff has some technical stuff behind it that may or may not be available at Virginia Commonwealth. I imagine that whether or not people are interested in implementing that, there's been several presentations at EDUCAUSE and other sort of higher education technologists have mapped out this particular workflow, but whether or not it's adopted at the individual university level is kind of up to the individual university. And I think that part of what Virginia Commonwealth's report is highlighting is that this is, they're saying very explicitly that this is a limitation, that it's not in Banner inherently. And so there may be some resistance on the part of their IT staff to implement something that isn't part of it, isn't sort of a inherent feature. And so I don't know what that is there, but I know that the report is recent, and I've found a number of different implementations of Banner. So I think it is a local customization that's causing that.
Thank you. So at the beginning, you had mentioned that it's often up to top-level administration to help set the culture. What if our top-level administration doesn't see themselves that way, that they agree there's a culture change that needs to happen, but it should happen further down low from the ground up, and that's not working? Like, do you have any suggestions for moving forward?
That's a good question. So we know from organizational change management that, in fact, that statement's not true, that culture is effectively top down. I think that especially if you are signed up for Emily's section of this webinar tomorrow, she's going to be talking about actual labor organization and may have more useful and intelligent things to say about that. I think that in the case that you're describing, it can be useful if you're getting that kind of abdication of responsibility, like I don't want to establish a culture because it's too hard or I don't perceive it as my job kind of stuff, then one way of getting that is kind of getting the people who do want things to change together to organize and say, what are our shared agreements? What do we want the culture to be? And kind of offering it back for comment. Because if somebody that high up is abdicating responsibility, then organizing to then offer what you would like it to be may be one way to get at that. But what arena they'll listen to it in or how they want it to be presented may be good questions to start. So if you're hearing that a lot, like maybe asking, how do you want us to do this? Because either they will tell you how they would like this to start happening, or they will just sort of expose a certain level of incompetence as a result. Either way, you're kind of gaining ground for more organization.
Okay, great. And then we do have one more question that came in. So we all know and agree that the word magic is not one that we want thrown about for what we do, but how do we broach that with other units in the library who continue to call what we do magic without offending them?
Oh, cool. That's great. I haven't had the opportunity yet to kind of push back like that. You're like the way you're suggesting. I've had it suggested to me, and this came up in a very specific kind of situation where a mentor told me, well, if they're going to insist that what you do is magic, then you're going to stop seeking input about it. But I think he can probably get away with that a little bit more than I could at the time. Probably education about how all of it works and how the process works and the amount of learning and training that went into that, and really kind of exposing, no, actually, I know it's just a few lines of JavaScript or whatever it is that you happen to be doing, and really exposing the process behind it and the amount of labor and that it doesn't come from nowhere. But I will think about that and probably mention it on Twitter, otherwise send it out. What a good response to someone kind of being very insistent about that framework is, because it really does diminish your effort and ability and all the time you put into learning. So I will think about that and respond to attendees in an email. Thank you for your question.
All right, thank you. And then we did one more that slipped in here, and it's a short one. So can you recommend any websites, forums, or social media accounts where one could follow discussion on these topics?
So mine is good. I just spent a whole webinar saying you should talk about your work and promote it. Mine is good. I'm on Twitter as Panoptigoth. Also, I think getting into CritLib, the hashtag there, we do need more tech services and systems people. Violet Fox is on Twitter, as is Jess Schomburg, and other folks who are part of the cataloging lab. They will have some other things available, and I can also, kind of expand on that question further to attendees if that would be useful, because I don't want to miss something where good and useful discussion is happening, and then not make that more widely available.
Yeah, that would be great if we could then include that with the email that we send out with the links to the recording. I'm sure our attendees would love that.
Yeah, absolutely, I can.
Awesome. So this will conclude our presentation. Again, thank you so much, Angela. This has been a really great session. And for our attendees, you will soon receive a short online evaluation form. And if you take a few minutes to respond to the questions, your comments are valuable and do help us plan future events. And the email will also include the links to today's slides and recording. And as we just mentioned, we'll try to put a list from Angela of other forums, social media, et cetera, that you can follow this discussion on. And you now also have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance. That information will also be included in the email. And so thank you again to our presenter, Angela Galvan, and to members of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, the ALCTS Office, and the ALCTS Program Committee. ALCTS also has 2 pre-conference events taking place at ALA Annual on June 21st. Please see the website for details and registration. And once again, thank you all for joining us today. We do hope that we see you tomorrow for part 2 of this virtual pre-conference. And this will conclude our session.